Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to be here, and I'm so excited to see that the slides have made it to the screen. I'm just going to, if you will excuse me, do a little experiment. Yeah, I think I'll stick with the keyboard. Okay, I will. Thank you. So, I would first like to begin by thanking the organizers of this symposium for their kind invitation and for their very gracious hospitality, and also to the sponsors of this symposium. But most importantly, in addition, I would like to thank the busy people I see in front of me who have many things I know to be attending to in their own organizations or in their studies if they are a student, but they have taken the time to participate in some learning and professional development through attending this symposium. So thank you very much for coming along. The focus of my talk is on new developments in evaluation, and I will reflect on what practices have changed. Oh, look at this. The technology is really firing now. So my plan is to reflect on what has changed in the last 20 years or 10 years, but also what opportunities remain for us if we want to develop evidence-based, new and impactful practice in our organizations. I'm also very conscious that we're running a little late due to the technology, so my plan is not to say fewer things, but to try and say them in a more concise way, so that we will be able to enjoy some refreshments and some informal discussions together at the break. So let's think about evaluation. And I suggest to you that the search amongst training and development practitioners for evaluation to identify the impact of our work has been a quest. It has been a quest for longer than I've been alive, for more than 60 years. We are very concerned to identify not just measures that we can use, but robust measures, trustworthy measures. We want those measures to influence our decisions and the decisions of the senior leaders in the organizations with which we work. And we want to make a difference. We want our work to have impact on what really matters to the organization. And my thinking about the topic of evaluation over the years has led me to believe that we have many discussions concerning three main areas, and those are the ones showing on the screen, concerned with evaluation or assessment, measurement and judgment, and most recently, whether we should standardize or differentiate. Now, over 60 years ago, Donald Kirkpatrick published his model of evaluation with its 4 levels. And since then, I would suggest we have got stuck in the Kirkpatrick model. And perhaps now is the time to think about how we might move beyond what the esteemed Mr. Kirkpatrick suggested to us. So I'll be thinking a little bit about how we might do that. And with regard to the first of the items on the screen there, just to mention about terminology, when I use these terms, when I use the term evaluation, I take it to mean when we are considering our effect and our impact as training and development professionals on the organization. Assessment is more individually focused. It is when we start to assess whether somebody has learned what they were intended to learn, or indeed whether they have learned some additional things. But assessment focuses, in my thinking, on the individual learner, and evaluation, our focus on evaluation, should focus on the organization as a whole. And I think this distinction between evaluation and assessment has become particularly important as our practice as training and development specialists has developed over the last 10 or 20 years. Now, this slide, in fact, nothing is ever useless forever. This slide, in fact, featured on a piece of research I published in 2007, over 10 years ago. And here I argued that we needed to move from a focus only on trying to identify, or I would now say assess, the effect of learning on individuals and the effectiveness of individual trainers, because remember, our Donald Kirkpatrick forms, the reaction level, is as much an assessment of the trainer as it is of the training that has been undertaken. And I suggested then that we should shift our thinking and try to focus on the effect of our work on the strategic level, on the extent to which the organization was better able to realize its strategy, and we would be, as a profession, better able to inform the strategic thinking of the organization. So here we have a different focus in time. The traditional approach to evaluation, which remains very prominent and very persuasive in much of our practice, it looks backwards. It looks at what we did yesterday and how effective it was. I was very taken when I arrived only last night in Kuwait, and somebody explained to me this morning that there are no sidewalks, no pavements in Kuwait City because people travel everywhere by car. So I will use this picture. Perhaps the traditional approach to evaluation is like driving the car looking only in the rearview mirror. We are looking at what we did, where we've been, what we have just passed, and perhaps our focus should be much more centered on where we are going and where our organization needs its people to go. So my suggestion is that we need to think much more carefully about how our practice in organizations is strategically relevant and how it can contribute and add value, to use the word of the professor this morning, add value to the work of our organization. But of course, in the last 10 years, our thinking about strategy has also had to be significantly updated. I would think when I started my career as an academic, and earlier than that, my career as a practitioner, our focus on strategy was always, as Professor Garavan said, top-down. The organization said this, so we tried to respond to what the organization said. We looked only inwards. We looked internally. And we have over time, and these visuals, I took these pictures from various academic articles that have been published over the years. We expanded our understanding and our notion of strategy so that we took better account of the external factors as well as the internal workings of the organization to create our agenda, and looked for a way in which we could learn from those external factors to inform the agenda for the organization, to help it to learn and to adapt to the future requirements. But this is still a very static model, and if we have heard nothing else this morning from both of the speakers, is that this world and the organizations for whom we work cannot be static. They must be flexible, they must be adaptive. The future arrives very fast. And so this model, which I took in fact from a recently published article by both Professor Garavan and by Dr. Carberry here, they argued that to make our organizations fit for the future, human resource development, learning and development, training and development activities need to work towards a situation where we have a very much more flexible workforce, a workforce that can deliver what we need it to deliver today, but can also be ready for change and prepared to learn the skills, the 21st century skills, and the attitudes and the commitments and the ethical values that will take the organization forward. So we need to focus our learning and development practices and then to evaluate our learning and development practices against the extent to which our workforce is flexible, the extent to which individuals are ready for change, the extent to which the organization might be accurately described as a learning organization, one that can change, one that can adapt, one that can innovate, but one that can also identify the things that make it special and able to deliver sustainable performance. And I was particularly inspired to hear that in the Vision for Q8, one of the pillars, one of the 7 pillars, is for creative human capital. For too long, we have worried too much about a static level of qualifications and credentials as our measure of human capital. But the future will depend on people being able to be creative and excited and able to commit to taking our organizations forward. So to summarize, the latest thinking, which is thinking but not necessarily practice, is that our organizational evaluation strategies need to focus on where we need to be in the future rather than what individuals may have achieved in the past. And this has great relevance to the next issue, which is the discussions and the debates over measurement and judgment. Because whilst I agree with Professor Garavan that we need to make better use of data, of analytics, we read a lot about big data, we read a lot about analytics in human resources. We need to make better use of that data, but only if it helps us to make informed and trustworthy judgments about the decisions and the activities we need to pursue. So my argument is that our evaluation practice for the future should not rely wholly on numbers. It should not rely entirely on quantitative data. I have never subscribed to the view that numbers speak for themselves. Numbers do not speak for themselves. Data is meaningless until we have analyzed it, until we have understood what it means and made some sensible judgments on the basis of that. So there are 2 dangers with an over-reliance on quantitative data. One is that we may in fact make a wrong judgment and measure the wrong things. It is very easy to measure some things, but it is not sufficient if we are measuring the wrong things. We will make ill-advised decisions. The other limitation of only relying on quantitative data is that it can tell us what is happening, but it may not explain for us why that is happening. And only when we understand why things are occurring can we have a balanced approach to our judgment and our decision-making. So my rather controversial argument is that a forward-thinking evaluation strategy in organizations will be grounded in evidence and data, but will further take account of those water cooler stories, the chatter that we sometimes hear and pick up that allows employees to have a voice without them feeling that they must respond to our questionnaires in a way that might please us, but does not fully reflect what they really think. So here, excuse me, here on this screen is another figure that I started to develop over 10 years ago, and I have continued to try to work towards. And it suggests that effective practice in evaluation at the organizational level will still examine how efficient the learning function, the training and development department is operating. That's very important. We cannot waste resources. It will focus, as Kirkpatrick wished us to do, on some return on investment measures. There are still big initiatives with which our companies may invest, and we need to know that it was worth the investment, and we need to learn some lessons from that. But more importantly, I argue, we should focus not just on return on investment, but return on the organization's expectations, its strategic expectations. How are we adding value to the achievement of the expectations of some of the stakeholders that Professor Garavan referred to, and particularly the expectations of at the senior management team. And in addition, as our organizations increasingly have to operate across sectors, across national borders, and in an interdisciplinary way, we need reliable benchmark and capability measures taken over a long period of time so that we know the trends, so that we know whether or not we are developing the learning and development approaches in a sustainable and in an effective way. We have an early warning system when the trends or the data gathered over time on a benchmark basis may show that we have a problem. The next thing that I've been very concerned to include in evaluation is to try to move away from only focusing on what happens in the classroom and the extent to which the intended learning outcomes were achieved. Because I certainly reflect in my experience that I have often embarked on some learning in my life, and I have, I hope, achieved most of the intended learning outcomes, but out of my learning, both formal and informal, has come a wealth of unintended learning, unanticipated learning. And when I look back professionally, it is some of those learning outcomes, those unanticipated learning outcomes, that have been most valuable to me as I have gone forward. Sometimes they have remained dormant for many months, maybe even many years. And then I find myself professionally in a situation, and the learning that occurred at that point, the experience, is highly valuable to me and very useful. And it seems to me we undervalue the social, the informal, the unanticipated learning that we achieve, but that our employees also achieve. And so any sensible evaluation strategy should be flexible enough to be able to leverage and take account of that, I would contend. So my argument is that an effective evaluation practice will involve using business data where they are relevant to the organization's priorities, but it will also involve making use not just of quantitative, but of qualitative data. The next thing that is very important, often overlooked in the practice in many organizations, is the communication back to the organization of the outcomes of our evaluation processes. I have seen many organizations where data is gathered and gathered and gathered, but it seems to remain in the training department. It seems to remain on somebody's computer, their laptop, their device, and it is not communicated back to the organization to inform decision making. Or if it is communicated back, it is not communicated in a timely way. The timing is wrong, or the way that the information is communicated is inappropriate for busy senior managers, for busy operational managers. So we need to maybe rethink our communication strategies as practitioners when we start to engage on a better, more evidence-based practice. So my last point, my last dilemma, relates to the debates, I guess, we have as practitioners of learning, as educators, and as trainers. And that is essentially, to what extent should we try to standardize what we do so that we can predict from it and we can ensure that it is of an appropriate quality? To what extent should it be different, strategically and practically different from what anybody else should do? This is a human dilemma. To what extent should we be like everybody else or not like everybody else? But it applies particularly in areas like human resources. And we see different strategic arguments in different countries and in different types of organizations. In some organizations, the focus is on achieving best practice human resources, best practice learning and development, and that fundamentally is a search for the highest standards, standards that we could all then aspire to. An alternative strategic approach is to say, no, we will try to be different from the competition. We will try to do things in such a different way that we can achieve a competitive advantage. Now, there are benefits to both of those, and there are difficulties with both of those approaches. But in recent months and recent years, it has caused me to think about where do we stand in learning and training and development with regard to the issue of standards. Now, the President this morning referred to the importance of developing professions and professionalism. And in many ways, standards are an important feature, a defining feature of a profession. The accountancy profession has standards. The legal profession has international standards against which it benchmarks itself. So where do we stand as a training and development profession? Do we have standards to which we aspire and achieve and measure ourselves? Thus far, the answer is no, but maybe we should be thinking about changing that. For organizations, standards have many advantages. Standardization is the only way from which sensible benchmarking can robustly be taken forward. Standardization is a way by which, if we have to work across sectors, if we have to work across companies, if we have to work across supply chains, that we know that the pieces will fit together. Technically, standards have been the basis for interoperability, and now maybe at an organizational level, we might think that standards might help our training structures to be properly, efficiently interoperable. And of course, if we have in place some standards, they provide a basis for comparison, for transparency, and for consistency in our practice. And in the last, myself, only in the last 3 years, I've become increasingly involved both in England, but also with the International Organization for Standardization, ISO, with some efforts to develop standards for human resources. And this visual is just, I took it from the website. 10 years ago, the ISO formed a Human Resource Management Technical Committee. So their task is to try to develop international standards by which practitioners and organizations can benchmark and assess their own processes of excellence in HRM. So far, after 10 years' work, they have published 12 standards, 16 more are under development, and one of those, which I have the privilege to be the convener, the chair of the working group, is concerned with developing standards in learning and development in the organization. So I hope that that work will be concluded in the next 2 years or so. And I apologize, I stole this slide from another presentation that somebody else made, but it just shows the type of work that this committee, this international committee, is trying to undertake. So there are only three pillars in the ISO vision. One is to develop standards focused towards organizational effectiveness. Another towards building capability in the organization, and that is where the learning and development standard would position itself. And indeed, where most work is still needed, where ISO really needs to try to find some more input, is around empowering and engaging people. Now, how does this relate with evaluation? Well, clearly, if we are trying to write a standard, to develop a standard that is consensual, that can be signed up to by practitioners in many different countries, there is no point in writing a standard about learning, training, and development if you do not think seriously about its effective evaluation. And I will say, working with ISO, there are 55 countries involved in this technical committee, and many of you will know finding consensus between 3 or 4 people in a meeting can be quite difficult. When you bring in the different perspectives of many, many different countries and regions of the world, it is quite an interesting discussion to identify how we might move forward. But we have come to the view with regard to organizational evaluation and individual learning assessment that our starting point should be the organization's strategic priorities and operational goals. We certainly feel then that the first part of any evaluation strategy will of necessity focus on the learning processes, on how efficient they are, and on how effective they are. But that is not sufficient. It's also important to focus on the assessments, the assessment of learning processes. To what extent have learning processes been completed? To what extent were the learning outcomes achieved? But more interestingly, for me, is the organizational impact, the difference that learning and development has made. And these are some of the metrics that we're trying to think about how we could develop at this stage. So we are interested organizationally at achievement measures. To what extent are organizational goals and targets being achieved? To what extent is there the culture and the environment for learning as a feature of the organization? We recognize too, and this is really crucial, that there are many risk and business continuity measures that are strategically important in any organization. So those metrics should also be in place. And then we will be looking to develop measures for organizational change readiness, for individual change readiness, and even more difficult and more challengingly, for innovativeness within an organization. So I'm going to try and finish off now very quickly to say that if I were to try to summarize my thinking about new developments in evaluation for impact, it is very, very important that we first of all plan our evaluation strategy. We do not rely only on Mr. Kirkpatrick and his 4 levels of evaluation. We plan how we could move beyond that. We need to identify where data already exists in the organization that we could use. For too long now, training professionals have been inventing their own sources of data, putting out their own surveys, doing their own data gathering, when probably some other function already has the data somewhere. So finding what data is available, and then identifying what additional information, step 3, data collection, is required. It is not enough to collect the data. We then must analyze that data in a rigorous and a trustworthy way before we review it and we report back. This is not rocket science. This is something we should have been doing for quite some time. And in fact, in preparing this talk, I came across an article written by 2 people, one of whom is an American, very well-respected scholar of training and development. Another is a new practitioner with a very bright future in front of her, who had undertaken a PhD alongside the professor. And they argued that what training and development needs is not more, in regard to evaluation, is not more research. There has been a lot of research done. Their challenge was to say, what we now need to do is to put that research into action. And maybe this is the roadmap from which we might work. So finally, my very last slide, and you will see there the picture of people on a quest, people on a charge. We are still searching for the best approach to evaluation. We will only achieve or get closer to our quest on our journey if we focus on organizational targets, change readiness, organizational resilience and risk management, future capability, attention to the agenda, not just of trainers and learners, but on the agendas of line managers, operational managers, senior managers, suppliers, and customers. And increasingly, in an increasingly regulated world, to ensuring that our organizations meet and exceed, where necessary, their legal requirements. So my call is for evidence-based evaluation, but mixed methods, not just quantitative. My call is for our practice to be accountable and transparent, for it to be based on coherent and consistent measures, and that we incorporate evaluation practice as part of our strategic planning processes. So I thank you very much for your patience. I know it has been a very long morning, but if there are some questions, I will be happy to try and address them.